Tēnā koutou. How green are EVs here in New Zealand? How much better are they than petrol cars? How much of a difference do they actually make? Or are they just a way for wealthy people to virtue signal? Let's start with a disclaimer. First of all, why is this important? Well, road transport makes up approximately 15% of New Zealand's gross emissions. So it's not our biggest thing, but it's a pretty big chunk. In my mind, the best way to compare EVs and ICE vehicles is via a life cycle assessment, which takes the emissions of an object's full life cycle into account. I've predominantly lent on an LCA dataset from the OECD International Transport Forum, as it seems like a really comprehensive set and generally agrees with a bunch of other studies that I've looked at. Here is the most basic way of comparing the LCA data for ICE and EV cars. Even in generalized international figures, it seems like EVs have a total decrease of emission of 9 tons of CO2 equivalent, or about 20%, but that's not that much, is it? Let's break this chart down before I talk about New Zealand specifically, starting with manufacturing. It is widely known that manufacturing of EVs is more carbon intensive than petrol or diesel cars. From this data, it seems like EVs generally lead to about a 90% increase in emissions during manufacturing. This can, however, be improved by either using smaller batteries or ensuring that the manufacturing process uses low carbon energy, like Polestar seems to be working on. Transport. The slightly higher weight of EVs causes a very small difference here, but it is a pretty small contributor to the total. This would, however, increase slightly in New Zealand's case, so I'll discuss this later. Use. This is where the big difference comes in. In the base case, we see a 40% decrease in emissions, but this is for a worldwide average grid, which New Zealand's is not. Infrastructure. The final chunk of impact is infrastructure, which is very similar with a slight increase of EVs due to their generally slightly higher weight. But what happens if you change some things up? What about hybrids? Plug-in hybrids? What if the grid has more carbon? What if it has less? What if the battery is smaller? And then there's New Zealand. Here's a little Frankenstein version of this model that I built for New Zealand, which takes our average grid carbon intensity and also doubles the transport emissions because we're at the bottom of the world. And this is what it looks like for us. That is a 24 ton, or about 55% decrease in emissions from ICE to EVs. This is the equivalent of one person flying from Auckland to Wellington 389 times. This roughly lines up with a really good LCA study that was done in New Zealand by Arup in 2015, which found a 60% reduction in emissions was achieved. This could also be improved further by continuing to decarbonize our grid and by consumers demanding more sustainable manufacturing processes. It is worth noting that the internal combustion engine cannot decrease its emissions. So, should we all buy EVs?
Nope, probably not.
Mainly because we can't all afford them, but also because we should be prioritizing non-car centric modes of transport such as e-biking, which, in comparison, only emit a few hundred kgs, not tons, kgs of emissions over their lifetime. But are they a good thing for people that can afford them to do? Yeah, it's arguably one of the biggest things that individual Kiwis can do to reduce their emissions, as long as we don't lose sight of the fact that individual actions are not going to abate catastrophic climate change, and that it is systematic change that will. So, maybe alongside buying that EV, try influence any of your friends that work at some of these companies. That'll be way better if we lived in a society that wasn't so car-centric. One where our kids could walk to school without the fear of being hit by a 2-ton flying box. One where we had affordable, available, and convenient public transport. One where we could bike places easily. One where we didn't have to get in the car to go to the shops or to go see our friends or to our jobs. But we kind of don't. So while we're trying to build that world, we're looking at options. I also know that emissions are not the only way to look into environmental issues, and that we should really be looking at things such as planetary boundaries, that you have to start somewhere. So if you want me to talk about things like resource depletion, mining, etc., let me know. Oh, and also, I'm just an energy engineer and have not conducted in-depth studies into this, so please investigate this yourself or look at the sources I've put on the screen below.